Good morning. And thank you very much for joining us. At the Washington Institute, we're very fortunate to be hosting His Excellency Minister Safin Dizai, who is the director of the Kurdistan Regional Government's Department of Foreign Relations. He's basically the de facto foreign minister of the KRG. This is the first visit of a high official from the new KRG cabinet to Washington, D.C., and the timing could not have been more interesting and better timed for this visit, given the protests that have engulfed Iraq since October 1st, and all of the risks and challenges, but perhaps also great opportunities that the Iraqi quest for a better democracy entails, on one hand. Within the KRG, the region that has had its own fair share of ups and downs in recent years and months, but also the implications and repercussions of the U.S. withdrawal from Syria and the impacts that major event in a neighboring country, a neighboring region to the KRG has had on the Iraqi Kurdistan. So on those three areas, I will be engaging the minister in a conversation for about half an hour, and then we'll open up to your questions. But first of all, thank you very much for joining us, and welcome to Washington, D.C., Your Excellency.
Thank you.
So first things first, the Iraqi protests. What's going on? Why are Iraqis protesting? And what role can the KRG play in leading these upheavals, this public anger, into more stability and a better government, rather than perhaps continuation of a status quo or, God forbid, aggression?
Right. Well, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me to this fine institution and with this fine group of people being here. Indeed, it's been 4 months since the new cabinet has been formed, and within my new capacity, it's my first visit, with the exception of the UNGA that I attended with the federal president, Dr. Barham Saleh. Of course, what we are witnessing in Iraq today, I would say it's an accumulation of 15 to 16 years of problems, mismanagement. And to be fair, I think Mr. Adel Abdul Mahdi, the current Prime Minister, should not, and it would be unfair to blame him for all these happenings and grievances. He's been burdened with this problem. He has inherited these problems. However, as Prime Minister and as government, they have to take measures in order to alleviate the concerns and the demands of the people. If you look at the TV screens, the images of the protesters, they are very young. Today, Iraq's population, 60% or more, is below the age of 30. Most of these individuals and groups of people either do not remember or have not lived through the era of the former regime, the Ba'ath regime. And since 2003, unfortunately, because of the degree of political instability and sadly of the sectarian violence and ISIS and lack of services, obviously it has all added up. There has been such protests in the past in other parts of Iraq, and in Basra in particular. Again, even in those days, those demands and those protests were genuine, but they were not dealt with properly, and they were not remedied. Under the former government of Mr. Abadi, we saw that there were violent protests in Basra. Their basic demands was for drinking water, electricity, services, equal opportunities, job opportunities. And when all this happened in early October, again, it was, I would say, spontaneous, peaceful. But it seems that the internal political dynamics and external factors has probably managed to hijack to the protests to serve certain agendas and create some political instability, and primarily aimed at the present government of Mr. Adel Abdul Mahdi. As we all know, Mr. Adel Abdul Mahdi is a very experienced politician, but he doesn't have a solid political bloc behind him, not in the parliament and not outside the parliament. So he is in a difficult position. We have tried from Kurdistan, the Kurdistan Regional Government, right from day one, clearly came out with a statement that the demonstrators' demands must be met, but it should be a peaceful demonstration and not to target public and private properties, and the security forces should refrain from using force against the protesters. However, we have seen a substantial degree of violence against the protesters. Over 300 people have lost their lives. 10,000 people have been injured.
Allow me to interject. I understand that Prime Minister Adel Abdul Mahdi has established a good relationship with the KRG. But you know that while he is the face of the public anger, the protests are not necessarily against the Prime Minister. And people realize that he himself doesn't even have any constituency. He is a compromised candidate. It's against the system behind him, that system of patronage, that corrupt system that benefits the elite, the parties in government, at the expense of services. Perhaps some of this political dysfunction, many of them were quoted and cited as justification for the KRG referendum, which we will get to later on, about 2 years ago. So in a way, here's an opportunity to change the current dynamic. And then all of a sudden, it surprises me that the KRG seems to be supporting Adel Abdul Mahdi and in a way trying to maintain the status quo. What is the KRG afraid of as being a worst case scenario coming out of these protests? And hence I go back to my question, if there is a risk that the KRG is afraid of, what can the KRG do in the absence of not being in the inability of quelling and meeting these demands, either on a short notice, in a short period of time, or quelling them violently as the Iraqi security forces have failed to do? What are KRG's risks that the KRG is afraid of, and how KRG actually be a force for good, for nudging this in the right direction?
If you recall, from 2003 onwards until probably 2008, 9, perhaps even 10, the Kurdish leaders were the kingmakers in Baghdad.
Right.
Late President Talabani, President Masoud Barzani, other leaders were in Baghdad during the governing council period in the remaking of Iraq. And obviously, in order for the Kurds to participate in the new Iraq, as you know, from 1991 2003, Kurdistan was almost semi-independent. It was a kind of a voluntary reunion in 2003. So the remaking of Iraq based on a federal democratic Iraq was the key elements that actually encouraged the Kurdish leaders to be part of the new Iraq. For a good while it went well, despite the sectarian violence and the bombings and what have you. So what we need to, as part of Iraq, definitely we want to see a stable Iraq. And when you look at alternatives under the present circumstances, to be honest, the picture doesn't look very good. So by blaming the government and doing away with the government and the constitution, as many people call for it, and even changing the political system, as some people call for it, this is extremely alarming. By doing away with provisional councils, that means having much more centralized authority, which may lead to a totalitarian rule in future. And this is not what we as Kurds fought for, and this is not what we participate to form the new Iraq. And I think this is the belief of many other groups in Iraq. And today, Kurdistan being somewhat more stable, and perhaps the political environment and the social, economical environment somewhat more stable, definitely we feel obliged to support Baghdad as much as we can, and particularly the current government, because it took months after the last election when the government was formed. And as you said very rightly, Mr. Mahdi was the compromise candidate. Mm-hmm. Now, can you imagine under the present climate to go for an election? By the way, the last election, the turnout was around about 20%. And you have members of parliament who managed to go to the parliament with 2,000 votes. I agree, the electoral law has to change. There has to be something more modern, more practical one, whereby people will vote for individuals who would truly represent them, and not to have this seats being changing hands for amounts of money. But under the present circumstances, to go for the maximum that people are demanding, or at least the political agenda is demanding, I think it will not bring stability to Iraq. Definitely, we have been encouraging the government to introduce reforms, try to listen to the public, and try to bring some services that are immediate needs of the people: water, electricity, security, job opportunities. Some are medium, some are long-term solutions. But the current government does not have the magic wand to resolve all the problems overnight, which has been accumulating over the past 15 years.
I mean, maybe a magic wand is too ambitious, but how realistic is it for this political elite in Iraq, given the diffusion of centers of power and the multipolarity of not only sectarian but also political, of reforming themselves out of a job? I mean, the street demands for a system that caters to good governance and not to sharing and dividing the spoils. So to ask this particular government, given its own corruption and failings, to just be better, how realistic is that?
Iraq has gone through difficult times and will continue to go through difficult times because of various reasons. First, the division, or if you look at Iraq today, I mean, officially Iraq being part of the Arab world, but it has lost that identity. Okay. Today, when you talk about Iraq, you talk about Sunni, Shia, and Kurds. And even within the solid Shia bloc, now we are seeing, each one going their own way. And this has created concerns amongst the Shiite community. And unfortunately, with the Sunni, there was no solid bloc as such. Even some of the key Sunni leaders, either they have left the country or they were forced to leave the country. And many people today do not truly see those who are in the parliament or at the peak of power from the Sunni sector are truly representing the Sunnis of Iraq. The only strong bloc that you have in the parliament with 58 parliamentarians is the Kurdish bloc. And with this in mind, we have been trying to help out, and our leaders, the president was in Baghdad a couple of days ago, federal president was in Erbil last week, trying to see how the situation can be salvaged politically, but also to oblige the government to take steps, because you cannot defend the government on one hand and not to expect to do things which are the genuine demands of the people. And the political elite, unfortunately, I'm not saying across the board, but certainly some of them, and some influential ones, they have different agendas. I mean, it's mostly to attract voters to their side and to serve specific interests rather than Iraq's interest.
Is there a role for the United States, a positive role for the United States to play, to nudge all of these uncertainties that you've highlighted in the right direction?
The formation of the last government, it took a while, and from US diplomats we used to hear different names, but everybody was surprised when Adel Mahdi's name came up. I think he was welcomed by the United States and definitely approved by Tehran.
Mm-hmm.
Then maybe, yes, they could have done something, but under the present circumstances, I don't think there is much leverage, to be honest. If and when the government changes and a new prime minister has been appointed, it will not be a candidate that would have the approval or perhaps would be friendly to Washington, I would say.
Okay. That's alarming. Let me ask you about ISIS on a related note. ISIS was declared defeated by former Iraqi Prime Minister Abadi, and obviously the United States also declared the defeat of ISIS caliphate. But we keep hearing from multiple sources, including US government sources, that as an insurgency, ISIS is very much alive and kicking and have the capacity to regroup. Given the relationship between KRG and the Iraqi government, the security relationship in particular, how able are both sides to maintain pressure in the disputed areas to make sure that they don't allow for an ISIS resurgence? Is there, put differently, are there ungoverned spaces in Iraq that would allow for ISIS to regroup?
They have regrouped. I mean, we're not talking about the possibility. In fact, it's a fact. They are there. The sleeper cells have woken up, and they're quite active. Almost on a daily basis, they are conducting operations against security people and the communities, putting a lot of pressure on local communities to support them. Some may willingly, others out of no choice. If you look at the border from Syria to Iran, from south of Sinjar, south of Mosul, Gayara, going to south of Tikrit and going all the way to Diyala, in certain areas between 10 to 20, 25 kilometers, it's a kind of a no man's land. And that occurred when in 2017 in most of these areas, Peshmergas withdrew. But the regular army, the Iraqi regular army, did not move in many places. So it has left that vacuum of security and authority, which has been filled by ISIS. ISIS roaming around, and they're believed to be 15 to 20,000 armed militants and terrorists between Syria and Iraq. As I said, they are conducting operations, and although there has been a fair degree of cooperation on intelligence bases between Erbil and Baghdad, and a couple of successful operations have been conducted against the targets of ISIS together. Some with airstrikes from the United States and the coalition. But we were pushing and still pushing for a joint mechanism, a tripartite mechanism perhaps, between the three sides that what we had in place until 2011.
You mean Iraq, KRG, and the United States?
Correct.
Or the coalition?
The coalition,
okay.
Yes. Everybody looks warmly to the idea, but practically nothing has happened on the ground. But like I said, I mean, on level of intelligence and certain joint operations, it has been successful.
Let's shift the focus a little bit more to perhaps KRG's internal issues. In 2017, the KRG conducted an independence referendum. And the repercussions from that have been rather harmful to KRG militarily, economically, and perhaps politically. But there has been a recovery ever since, especially as also you alluded to earlier, with the new government in Baghdad. How is that recovery going? And how would the protest movement in Iraq is going to affect that rapprochement between KRG and Baghdad and KRG's domestic recovery from ISIS, but also from the economic decline that it faced afterwards?
You mentioned the referendum. Obviously, when I said voluntarily Kurdistan rejoined Iraq, and they played an active role in providing the best of their political leaders, including late Talabani and many others who actually served in Iraqi government successfully. New Iraq, democratic federal Iraq. But as we moved along, this concept was forgotten, or it was marginalized.
Nice. And
the constitution was totally sidelined. So this sent alarm bells, to be honest. And we recall under Prime Minister Maliki, he made moves, with military moves, towards Sinjar and Khanaqin, which was not successful. According to some reports, I don't know how truth they may be, and he had ordered his commanders, well, let's not push now, let's wait for the F-16s to arrive and then we'll do the job better. So with that mentality, it was very difficult, to be honest, to continue with that arrangement, because we saw more of a centralized authority. And to make things worse, February 2014, KRG's budget was cut. This coupled with the ISIS onslaught and with the arrival of 2 million IDPs and refugees, which incidentally increased the population of Kurdistan by 30% in a matter of 6 months. And no assistance from Baghdad for the refugees and IDPs. We had a 1,000-kilometer front line with ISIS, a very costly war, losing 1,800 Peshmergas, 10,000 wounded. So we were obliged to export our oil in order to make ends meet. Obviously, government changed. Dr. Abbadi became the prime minister, and this policy continued. As we were about to end the war on ISIS officially, we didn't see any shift in the positive direction. And the idea of referendum was actually there before war of ISIS. But because of ISIS, it was postponed. So the Kurdish leaders came together and they contemplated the idea that, yes, we should go for a referendum. The referendum was not binding. It was not the idea of declaring independence the following day. But because many times when the Kurdish leaders were talking to Baghdad on these issues, well, they said this idea is coming from KDP, PUK doesn't share it, or this is from this group and this. So the idea was when the Kurdish leaders go to Baghdad, they will have a solid people's support behind them rather than a political party. And with 93% vote in favor, that was sufficient to support the argument. Unfortunately, the efforts of our friends came rather late in the day.
Friends?
Be it Washington, be it some Europeans. Okay. I recall very well, it was on 13th of September, just 12 days before the referendum, when a draft letter was provided, was supposed to be that of Secretary Tillerson. It basically was asking for postponement or not to do the referendum, but with no assurances given that it can be supported or they can put pressure on Baghdad to sort out these problems and so on. So it was too late in the day because the intention for having the referendum was on 7th of June. So there was ample time for people to come and try to mediate between Erbil and Baghdad and try to find a solution forward. But unfortunately, it came too late in the day. And then, of course, the consequences, as you know, it was armed conflict between Peshmergas and federal army. Lives were lost. Territories were lost. But I must say, by trying to corner Kurdistan and try to undermine its authority, because the intention was to go further, even come to Erbil, go as far as Fish Khabur, go as far as Ibrahim Khalil, the only border gate with Turkey and other parts. So the French president, he actually invited our prime minister at the time. And he was very explicit in his press conference that Baghdad should end this aggression and they should come to terms and dialogue with KRG, which eventually happened. But since the period that of Adel Abdul Mahdi, yes, the situation has improved politically. There has been more interaction. Delegations are going back and forth on all levels, ministerial, technical, security, military, intelligence. in March, as a result of gentleman's agreement, Baghdad released certain funds towards the payment of salaries for KRG civil servants. For 4 years, we had to go through austerity measures by cutting down salaries from 15% to 75%. So at least for the last 8 months, salaries are being paid in full. The idea was from March until October, we will be in discussions in order to come to some arrangements as far as the oil, as far as the budget. As we were about to make a breakthrough by end of September, unfortunately things happened in Baghdad, and it seems that priorities have changed for Baghdad. And unfortunately, that file has been put on ice right now.
You mentioned reforms of the economy because of the necessity of the war on one hand and the cutting of the KRG share of the federal budget. I mean, the KRG had its fair share of protests in the past against, lack of services, but perhaps also some of the systemic nature of KRG. Yes, the KRG is economically more developed than Iraq, and yes, it has greater stability, and it does look like a very different part of the country. But as the aftermath of the referendum showed very clearly, you still have major structural flaws in the KRG, in particular the Peshmerga, the duopoly of rule, the geographic duopoly that sometimes comes together, but oftentimes the differences are very visible. The loyalty of the Peshmerga still being more partisan than to the government. In a way, some of the problems that now the Iraqis are protesting against, but instead of having 20 factions in KRG, we've had these split from the 1994 civil war up to date. And yes, there have been times of more harmony, but it takes very little pressure for those differences to come back to the bear. What is the current cabinet's plan to really structurally reform this kind of bicameral nature of KRG governance, of these two parties, which in a way have lots of economic and military capture in two geographic zones, and also become an example of all of the ask from the United States, from the international community, and also from the Iraqi people about how all arms and guns should be under the control of the state and not the parties. Maybe it's harder for Iraq when you have so many different groups and so many political parties, but in Kurdistan it's only two. What are the prospects of KRG becoming a model, showing a good example of how that could be done? How do you bring diverse political militant groups under the umbrella of the state?
Yeah, I think it's a very valid point. And I think the efforts and the measures that have been taken in the last several years towards reforms in the Ministry of Peshmerga Affairs with the help of our coalition friends and partners, certain divisions have been united, and in terms of training, in terms of logistics and armament, they fall under the Ministry of Peshmerga Affairs. You have 14 divisions. There are two specific units, as you said, Peshmerga units of the KDP and PUK. Yes, they are still there, but more recently there has been positive steps forward in order to make sure that at least in terms of administration and in terms of finance, they are under the jurisdiction of the Ministry of Peshmerga Affairs and the KRG. Both vice presidents of the Kurdistan region, both were former ministers of Peshmerga and military commanders, one from Goran, one from PUK. They've been very helpful, and there has been serious meetings by the president with the KDP and PUK that this is end of the line and they have to push for this reform. So I believe the groundwork is being prepared. At some point soon, they will commence with the technicality. It's not going to be easy, I assure you, but it will happen. Peshmerga, since 1961, for example, KDP was the only political party, and all the Kurdish movement and the Peshmergas were under the KDP. And in 76 onwards when you had PUK, and then the political parties, each party had its own military wing. But now it's coming together. But when it comes to loyalty, the Peshmerga's loyalty is to Kurdistan. Yes, they may be controlled by political parties, but definitely we have seen a successful example of it during the war against ISIS, where we had KDP, PUK, Socialist Party, X, Y, and Z. Not only that, but from Bashur, from Bakur, from Rojhelat, from Rojava, they were all there in the same front line to fight the common enemy, which was ISIS.
I have a few minutes left for my question before we get to the audience. Let's talk about Syria and the American withdrawal from Syria. Obviously, that has had repercussions for the KRG, both on a domestic level, kind of reminding some of the recent history that you mentioned, how the KRG felt that the United States was too late to engage to avert the aftermath of the referendum. But also you have a direct impact. Refugees from Rojava, from Syria, are flocking into Kurdistan. How has the KRG interpreted and understood what happened, what the United States did, but also what Turkey did, the Turkish military incursion, and how does that, affect, if not change, KRG's foreign relations, particularly with Turkey? And you know Turkey very well. I should mention that the minister was the KRG representative in Ankara for many years.
KDP, sorry.
KDPs.
Yeah. We don't have a KRG rep there yet. I think we should be discussing events and the facts on the ground as they are. Of course, we have a great deal of affinity for our brethren in Syria, Turkey, and Iran. But at the same time, we all have to be pragmatic. Where we are, the Kurds, the division of the Kurds 100 years ago was not upon their own will and desire, but it's a fact on the ground. In Syria, sadly, the Kurds have gone through great difficulties, denial of citizenship, demographic change in the early 60s, what used to be called Hizam al-Arabi, or the Arab Belt, moving Kurdish tribes from the border with Iraq and Turkey to other parts of Syria. In aftermath of 2011 or so, when events unfolded in Syria, the Kurdish political parties became more active. Our advice as KRG and the political leadership in Kurdistan was that they should be very cautious and make sure that they will not ever getting into a situation which would create animosity between communities, because in some areas where the Kurds live, you have different communities: Arabs, Assyrians, Chaldeans, Armenians, Turkmens. So, but also try to form a front that would strengthen your position as Kurds for any eventuality in Syria, be it with the opposition or be it even a dialogue with the regime in Damascus. Unfortunately, the efforts to bring them together and the conferences in Erbil and Dohuk was not very successful. PYD began to operate by itself and not to allow other Kurdish political parties to operate in the region. With YPG, recruitment and armament and ISIS's appearance there, obviously it was an opportunity for them to be a strong and good fighting force. And that's where the coalition and primarily the United States supported them with all the armament and support. As a result of that, 11,000 people have been killed, or they've lost 11,000 fighters, over 10, 15,000 wounded. But lack of clarity, to be honest, from Washington vis-a-vis Syria and the future of Syria has made the hands of the other players stronger. Today in Syria you have global powers, you have regional powers, and you have smaller actors, non-state actors. And the Kurdish issue there has been somewhat lost, to be frank. If you look at it from distance, YPG perhaps has been used as a security company to fight a specific enemy, and the job is done. But you have a people living there, and their fate and their future, it is in disarray.
But I mean, you suggested, correct me if I'm wrong, that if the YPG was not alone and there were other Kurdish parties as part of this fighting force, would have, like the NKSF, for example, would have that deterred Turkey, you think?
It's not so much that. I mean, if I can go back one step, in those days, 2013, 14, perhaps, PYD enjoyed extremely good relations with Ankara. Mr. Saleh Muslim was in Turkey on a regular basis. And incidentally, KDP, PYD did not enjoy good relations, and the former foreign minister of Turkey, Mr. Davutoğlu, he was trying to mediate between KDP and PYD. But things start to go in a different direction when PKK came to the scene and tried to impose its influence on the Kurds of Syria. And that's when Turkey, if you look at it from Turkish perspective, and the claims that they have, their 900-kilometer border with Syria is under danger. Giving this pretext for this incursion. The incursion itself, of course, that's one thing, but those who are actually spearheading the incursion, the proxies, they're the bad news, because their misconduct and their bad record in Afrin leads everybody to believe that they will do the same as they have done the same in many parts that incursions have taken place. So we are extremely concerned by the turn of events there. Hundreds of thousands of people are on the move. If the zone of operation expands, most of these people will come to Iraqi Kurdistan as refugees. For the last 6 weeks until now, we've had almost 16,500 refugees already coming to us, adding to the 250,000 who are already there since last 8 years.
Who's helping you with the refugees? Anyone?
Some international agencies, UNHCR. Prior to that, actually, we had serious discussions with the foreign missions based in Erbil, UN agencies. UNHCR has taken measures to accommodate for up to 30,000 people, but beyond that, their means will be limited.
I have other questions about KRG's energy policy, and particularly in relation with Turkey in particular, but we can get that to during the Q&A. But let me ask you my final question. You've come as the new Minister of Foreign Relations of the KRG to Washington, and this is, as I mentioned earlier in the introduction, you're the first official from the new cabinet to visit. In addition to your very astute analysis, what messages and questions have you brought to Washington, and what are you going to take home? And I understand that Bayan Khan and company have kept you very busy the past week.
Well, as you said very rightly, it's the first official contact of the KRG cabinet, new cabinet, with Washington, although we've had delegations from Washington visiting us, congressional delegations and others recently. But I think what was important for us, we feel that there's a great deal of support and sympathy for the Kurds as a whole. But we wanted to get into certain specifics regarding Kurdistan region in Iraq, and the prospect of the developments and the uncertainties what's happening in Baghdad, and our relation with Baghdad, the dialogue that has been initiated and has been supported by Washington, where we are, just to brief them on where we are, and also the scenarios that can be drawn on the basis of the present circumstances. Of course, we feel that the support for Peshmerga is a must. It should continue. The training program, the reform program, led by the United States and other coalition partners, a continuous support for stability of Iraq as a whole, but definitely Kurdistan as a story of success should be helped and should be supported both economically and militarily in order to be sustainable.
And how attentive has this Washington been to your requests?
They listen very carefully, so we are waiting for whatever decisions may be taken.
Okay, that was very diplomatic. But you're right, we have to wait and see. With that, I'll open up to your questions. Please wait for the mic and identify yourself and ask a question. I'll be taking 2 questions at a time for the interest of time, Kaksafi. And we'll try to cover as many questions as possible. Barbara Leaf.
Thanks very much for those remarks, Excellency. One of the issues I'm very interested to get your thoughts on is the evolving role of Iran in Iraq, in the eyes of the Iraqi public, in fact. And that is the criticism of Iran's relations with Iraq, with the government in Baghdad, with its intrusiveness into Iraqi affairs has obviously been a prominent feature of the protests. How do you evaluate all of that?
Okay, thank you. Kak Bilman.
Thank you, Kak Bilal. Kak Safin, my question for you is, you mentioned political elites in Iraq. You sort of touched on this as well, but what is the KRG doing to address the political elite within the KRG itself? I understand the new KRG cabinet and whatnot, the new government, but there are real grievances among Kurds inside KRG, and there has been prior protest as well. So there is a big political elite, a barrier that average Kurds are not able to overcome. Quickly, my second question is, as for, you mentioned slightly on Rojava. Is KRG doing anything to salvage its relationship with the Kurds in Syria? Because I don't believe they see themselves as you mentioned a security company. These are fellow Kurds. There is a huge prospect of economic opportunities with the Kurds in Syria. What is the KRG doing with this? Thank you.
Okay, so we have 3 questions.
Right. Well, let me just take it on the last remark. I said they are being treated as a security company. Services rendered, that's it. And I think it's a fact. We have seen it. I'm not making a statement. I'm stating a fact. But regarding, we still continue. I mean, we're trying to bring all the groups together in order to put their house in order. And the difficult circumstances, as you said very rightly, to salvage what is salvageable. At the same time, we also maintain our challenge with Turkey and expressing these concerns and what's happening on the ground. So we're working on several fronts amongst the Kurds of Syria itself, as well as with Washington, with other key players, and Turkey as well. Regarding the political climate back home, of course, we are not claiming to be a perfect example of self-rule and to be immune from all this trouble that's happening from other parts of Iraq. We've had our share of grievances, and the people also have their share of grievances. But you have to draw certain parallels or make comparisons in terms of services, in terms of security, in terms of job opportunity, in terms of many aspects of daily needs of life. I think the comparison, there's a huge difference between Kurdistan and the rest of Iraq, which is very sad. Iraq being such a rich country, and Iraqis deserve a much, much better life than they have already. And I'm talking about from Fao to Zaho, without any exception. But with the past experience of the key opposition parties, demonstrations, rallies, fine. Now, at least one of those key parties is in government. There may be some other smaller parties who may spearhead the demands of the public. I think it's a genuine thing to do, to make the government aware of what's happening down and in the, let's say, the poorer sector and the below poverty line, if I may. The government has to be aware, and normally it has its own ways and means to learn, but of course the political parties, the journalists and individuals, civil rights society, civil society, they are the ones who can let the government know that there are some problems here and there. And the government has been very open to this criticism, and we don't claim that everything's perfect in Kurdistan. Coming to the question of the lady here,
Iran.
On Iran, I think everybody knows that there is a great deal of affinity and, let's say, cultural, religious, historical ties between Iraq and Iran. Perhaps more so in post-2003, and perhaps many of the leaders in Iraq at one day, they were opposition figures and based in Iran. So apart from the political relation, but there are also personal relation between many leaders of both sides. But let's not forget that Iraqis consider themselves as Iraqis. And let's not forget there was 8 years of bloody war between Iraq and Iran, 1980-88. I'm not saying that there is any kind of vengeance of any kind from Iran against Iraq or vice versa, but as we have seen in certain areas of Iraq, there has been flag burning, whether it was spontaneous or it was orchestrated, I cannot tell. But in terms of economical relation, cultural, historical, political, security, there is some, I wouldn't say integration, but certainly a very close relation between the two. Now, some people may say it's total influence of Iran over Iraq. I think I'll leave it to interpretation, but it is there. That relation is there, and in the past, Iran has opened its doors to Iraqi refugees and the Kurds in particular during Halabja and Anfal. But at the same time, I must underline that Iraq is a sovereign country, and it must preserve its sovereignty, and it should be respected, be it by Iran or by anyone else. From time to time, yes, this sovereignty may have been violated, and the political climate in Iraq may, to a degree, allow this kind of interference, if I can call it.
Kaksafin, can I follow up on Ambassador Leif's question about the KRG Iran relationship? If you could comment on that. The conventional wisdom in Washington is that after the referendum, the KRG has kind of kissed and made up with Iran in a sense. And I was also wondering if you were interested in commenting on the KRG being brought up in the cables, the Iran cables that were published in the New York Times.
I mentioned about the close relation between Iran and Iraq. It goes across the board, but when it comes to Kurdistan, I think whoever has visited Kurdistan, you can visibly see there is less Iranian presence. When I say presence, I'm not talking about military people or political presence of any kind, even in terms of trade, in terms of business and what have you. So Kurdistan has maintained stable relation with Iran, as I said, for the reasons of historical reasons. There are 10 million Kurds in Iran. We had good relation with Iran under the Shah and under the present regime. So this cannot be denied, and we have a common border with Turkey, with Syria, with Iran. So we need to maintain good, stable relation with our neighbors. But to say that Kurdistan is under the domain of Iran, I think that would not be the right statement. Secondly, economically, yes, we do enjoy good ties with, and sometimes we get complaints that maybe the Kurdish market or the market of Kurdistan is more open to Turkey rather than to Iran. But there's a competition in the market. The cables that you mentioned, I think there are a lot of contradictions in that. I mean, already the KRG has denied part of it that Nechirvan Barzani was involved. Here I too totally deny this. I think it sounds very wild, to say the least. Indeed, Nechirvan Barzani's character is such that he has contacts with Europeans, with regional powers, and he has access to all the leaders. So when he talks to the Americans and when he talks to the Iranians, definitely he shares the views that the American view on such a thing towards you is this. So you have to try to understand. And by the same token, sharing the same views with other friends. It doesn't mean that you are acting, if I may, as an informer. I mean, which is ridiculous. I mean, what's come out in the reports, I think it's and compared to the previous parts, there are certain contradictions claiming that every single reporting has been made, but failing on what has been said, and so I wouldn't buy that.
Okay. Ambassador Rand, Ambassador Rand Rahim, and then Roy. Pass on the mic.
Rand Rahim, thank you, Minister Dizay, for being here and speaking so frankly. I also would like to follow up on Ambassador Leif's question, but in a little bit of a different way. You mentioned the cultural, historic, economic, political ties between Iraq and Iran. Wouldn't you say that those ties pertain more to the Shia political parties than to the population? In other words, these economic, political, cultural, and so on really reside in the relations between certain Shia political leaders and Iran, and not with the mass of the population. And arguably, in fact, for the last several centuries, the histories of Iraq and Iran have been very divergent. I mean, we were under Ottomans and so on and so forth. So I don't really see that, and I'd like you to comment on it. Who is it exactly that has those ties? And I think that the follow-up question is, what we're really talking about is political influence of Iraq, irrespective of our historical. I mean, we have historical ties with Turkey, with Syria, etc., economic ties with Turkey, certainly in the KRG. It's the question of what is the level, how would you evaluate the Iranian political influence on decision-making, policy-making in Baghdad? Thank you.
Then Roy.
Yes, Roy Gutman from the Institute. I'm a journalist. Thank you very much for doing this morning. You mentioned that the YPG is being treated as a security company whose patron is leaving the scene. So what happens to them? Do their leadership go back to Kandil, from which many of their officers came? Do they fold into the army of the government of Syria? They're well armed, they're trained. Do they have the clout just with that alone to help to negotiate some kind of a political shift in Syria so that Kurds have more rights, obviously under their control? Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Yeah. I think if you read in between the lines, I did answer that. I did mention that there was 8 years of a bloody war, which obviously almost 1 million lives were lost. So, and I also mentioned that most of the leaders in power today were in the opposition, and many of them were actually based in Iran. So that kind of relation was strong then and is still valid. But the population at large, I would say they feel themselves as Iraqis, and certainly they do not want to be in the domain of anybody.
The other question was about the future of Rojava that Leroy asked, yes.
Unfortunately, that's the term, because the reason I use that phrase and description of security company, I actually heard that from a Westerner who used to go to Rojava, and quite an influential individual, to write reports about what's happening. And on one occasion he came back, and that was 2 years ago. He said, from what I have seen, these people will be abandoned once the job is done. And they are being treated like a security company. So it is not my own, let's say, description or creation. They are very good fighters, yes. Well equipped, well trained, young, dynamic, patriotic. But as far as their fate, I mean, we're talking about the Kurds. I mean, first and foremost, the plight of the Kurds in Syria has to be looked into seriously, and there has to be a political solution to their future, be it with the present regime, which seems to have survived, and at some point, PYD was trying to approach Damascus. Had they approached Damascus 2 years ago, probably they would have got a good deal. But today, I'm not sure of that. I think Russians try to bring them closer. I think these efforts may continue. But of course, it depends on our friends in Washington. I mean, how they would continue to remain there. Because at some point, when PYD was trying to approach Damascus, from what I know, Washington was not very keen. And not to allow them to reach a deal with Damascus, and not to remain there forever to provide some guarantees. So what can they do? It's really difficult to say what will happen. But I think as far as the military force, definitely in future Syria, when there's stability and Syria returns to normality, I don't think they would allow such a force, whether you call it militia, whether you call it whatever, to exist. So the only choice would be to reach a deal with Damascus and to integrate them with the army, or perhaps if you have some kind of, let's say, autonomy, you can have a regional security force of some kind.
I have 4 minutes. I could probably do another round of questions. Yes, let's get you.
I'm Emily Meredith. I'm a reporter with Energy Intelligence. And you mentioned that in September you felt that you were close to a breakthrough in negotiations with Baghdad. Do you have any hope of that being resolved, coming back to those talks? And are you concerned that the pressure is now very high on Baghdad to push harder for the return of this 250,000 barrels of oil per day?
Thank you. I can squeeze in one more. Oh, I'll ask the other question. I'm curious about. I mean, you're in Washington, and there have been news on and off about United States imposing one form or another sanctions on Turkey. How does this dynamic of sanctioning, but kind of schizophrenic U.S. relationship with Turkey, Congress being on one spectrum and the White House being on another, how does that impact the KRG's ability to seamlessly continue exporting oil through Turkey? So the question about KRG Baghdad's relations first, and then mine.
I think the issue of the oil has been a pending issue for quite some time. The export of oil started 23rd of May 2014, 3.5 months after the budget was cut from Baghdad. So we were obliged to export oil, initially starting with 50,000 barrels per day, reaching up to 500,000, including the 200,000 from Kirkuk. After events of October 2017, we lost Kirkuk oil, and the production of Kurdistan at that time was around about 250,000 by itself. and that's where the 250,000 figure comes. But since then, the production has increased to 450,000 or so. The idea of handing over 250,000 barrels to Baghdad, we have not rejected that idea. But if Baghdad wants to take the asset, they have to also take the liabilities, because we have commitment with the private companies who have the infrastructure of oil was non-existent in Kurdistan, and we have production sharing contracts rather than service contracts like the rest of Iraq. These producing companies, they are not charity organizations just to hand over the oil to us and not to get anything in return. So if Baghdad, and as we have argued, that if they're ready to deal with these oil companies directly, we'll be more than happy to hand it over to SOMO. Instead of selling it to any oil company internationally, we can give it to SOMO. SOMO can send it to we can deliver it to SOMO in Jehan.
SOMO is the Iraqi State Oil Marketing Organization, just for reference.
So they can handle it. But that was argued back and forth, and they looked warmly to the idea, not only the 250,000, but perhaps the entire production, so long as there's a better arrangement, and for KRG to have a representative with SOMO, because SOMO was set up under the former regime and a different setup where Kurdistan was not oil-producing region. So technical discussions has taken place, and as I said, there was some understanding and positive atmosphere, but it was not concluded. On the oil exports.
On how U.S.-Turkey relations is going to impact KRG Turkish relations with regard to exporting oil.
Of course, for us, it's vital to maintain the oil export presently, because what we receive from Baghdad is about 55% of the salaries that are being paid since March of this year. The remaining amount has to be covered by KRG as a result of the oil proceeds that are being sold via Turkey. We brought up this subject both with the State Department and also with the Congress, that hopefully, if any measures are taken, obviously KRG's state of affairs should be taken into consideration.
My last question, and when I asked you about what messages you take back to Kurdistan, your answer was not, let me put it this way, it was not confidence inspiring. And you were also in the answers critical of how the United States handled the referendum, and how they also handled Syrian Kurds and the SDF. So somehow, in the past 2 years, Kurds in Syria and Iraq have had two nosebleeds. So Kurd to Kurd. What is the future of the Kurds? What's the right path? In the KRG, it was a quest for statehood, and you gave all of the reasons that were outlined to you of why that's not the right idea or what's not the right approach. Somehow Sykes-Picot are still with us. And then you look at the Syrian Kurds, who did not ask for a state. They were it was a very minimalist demand, just for the U.S. to stick around so there won't be any conflicts with, in particular Turkey, but also, keep the pressure on ISIS. And yet that did not go so well. And yet at the same time, you have so much public sympathy in the United States, the U.S. media, and large swaths of society. What is the right path for the Kurdish nationalist movement? And you yourself have been doing this for decades. Not only you, your whole family has been in this liberation movement. So let's just take kind of a step back and say the Kurds have tried many approaches to gain more rights in the Middle East, being the largest ethnic group without a state. There is the region experience, there is the self-autonomy experience, there is the push for independence. Given that history and given that experience, what works and what doesn't work, and how to move forward. Probably my main question is, how do we move forward rather than lingering in history?
Well,
That was a big emotional question, by the way.
well, the Kurds, for sure, they always have their mountains, but
Not every Kurd.
but-
Syrian Kurds don't have
but-
mountains.
but we also have friends as well.
Okay.
I think from what we have seen over the last months, and well, definitely since 1991, if we look at it, when we had the exodus of 1991, no-fly zone and safe haven and 36 parallel, and it actually laid the foundation for the creation of federal entity of Iraqi Kurdistan that we enjoy today. So we are grateful to that, and that was spearheaded by United States, France, Britain at the time. Security Council Resolution 688 was passed. So we are grateful to that. But of course, what we feel, the calamities and the sufferings of the Kurds, if you only talk about more recent history of Anfal and Halabja, probably qualifies for much more than what we have now. Nevertheless, I think we are pragmatic, we are realistic, and we understand the geopolitics of the region. This is why we always say that the Kurds should enjoy their democratic rights within the countries that they live in. The model that we have in Kurdistan cannot be duplicated in Turkey or Syria or in Iran. However, in those countries, they should find a way forward with a formula that would enable them to as first-class citizens, and then to enjoy their democratic and cultural rights as a Kurdish ethnic group. Indeed, in Washington today and up in the Hill, there is a great deal of support and sympathy, and perhaps even more than that, I think they have been very vocal, and even with legislations and bills, they've been very clear in the support of the Kurds as a whole. We appreciate that, we value it, but it comes down to interests. You know, every country, big or small, they have their interests, and the Middle East is a part of the world where there are too many players, too many interests at stake and at risk. So you have to try adjust your politics and your policies according to the bigger powers, not necessarily to surrender to their will, but definitely try to accommodate the concerns that they have and accommodate the interests that they have. But and that's not very easy balance, to be honest. But if you look at the survival of the Kurdish political parties, such as KDP since 1946, PUK since 1976, to survive in this environment, I think we should take our hats off for them, because bigger parties like the mighty Communist Party, which covered the entire Middle East, has not survived. The nationalistic parties from the Nasserites and all of those parties, the Baathists, with the exception of Syria, they have all not survived. So we are survivors, and but of course we have to plan our steps ahead carefully and not to lose our bearing. Unity of the Kurds is important, and there are talks of some kind of national congress for the Kurds, but the agenda has to be clear. It is not, the idea should not be to provoke our neighbors or the Arabs and Turks and Persians and all other communities that we live together. And we will continue to make Kurdistan a good example, hopefully, of coexistence with Chaldeans, Assyrians, Armenians, Turkmens, Arabs, Shebeks, Sabia, Yazidis, and so on. It hasn't been easy for us, but I think we have pulled it through. And definitely we will try to, with the support of good friends here and elsewhere across the world, I think we can make it.
Well, Kaksafin Dzai, Your Excellency, you are a master diplomat, and KRG is lucky to have you. Thank you so much for joining us, and thank you so much for joining us, and thanks to the Minister.